American politics is witnessing some shifting coalitions. And not enough attention has been focused on this because, well, there's not enough attention given to the deep ideological cross-currents of American politics. It used to be, I remember when I first came to Washington in the mid-1980s, there was a lot of discussion among liberals and among conservatives about who are the liberals, who are the conservatives, and what is the real dividing line between them. Are liberals liberal in the classical sense, or is there a kind of modern liberalism that is not only a departure from, but in some ways at war with classical liberalism? Classical liberalism, by the way, is merely the defense of liberty across the board. So similarly, on the conservative side, there were some who argued that conservatives were merely classical liberals. It was conservatives who were the custodians of the liberal tradition. There were others, myself included, who argued that conservatism was a kind of hybrid. It incorporated classical liberalism, yes, but added to that a particular concern for social and personal and civic virtue. And so it was classical liberalism plus what was then sometimes called social conservatism. And I think it is that amalgam on the right that defined the Reagan coalition. So the Reagan coalition, to sum up, was classically liberal in economics, but socially conservative in the area of culture. But where are we now with all that? If we fast forward to 40 years later, we seem to have now not just these two camps, the conservative camp and then the liberal camp. Of course, the liberal camp in the 1980s was defined as being economically redistributionist or sort of welfare state-ish. And then the liberals were also kind of permissive, or you may say libertarian, on social issues. So I have the right to do what I want with my own body. I should have the right to, in a sense, unlimited free speech. Seems odd to say, but liberals were the defenders of that in the 1980s. And there was a small libertarian camp, and the libertarians always saw themselves as the most consistent of all. The libertarians said basically, we are the only people who support liberty both in the economic sphere and in the sort of moral and cultural sphere. So the libertarians always looked at both the liberals and conservatives as sort of inconsistent or trying to weld together elements that didn't really go together. I think if we look today, I see not two camps with then some straggling libertarians sort of sulking by the side, but rather four camps. And the four camps need to be kind of spelled out, and probably I'll do no more today than to just spell them out so you can think about who these camps are. And I'll talk further in the days ahead about how these camps are changing, which one is getting stronger and which one is getting weaker. But let me just try to identify the four camps. You do have still I would call them the Reaganite conservatives. And the Reaganite conservatives you can describe as economically free market or liberal in the classical sense, and then socially conservative. I think that's still the majority in the Republican Party, but it's not the only camp that is right of center. That's one of the camps. The other camp is, well, this is almost a new movement, a working class movement that is now, I'd say, transforming the Republican Party. And this is a camp that can be loosely called populist. And by populist, I mean, this is a camp that does not hesitate to say that the government does have a role in the economic sphere. These people are not libertarians. They believe that government can and should subsidize, for example, the family. They support things like the earned income tax credit. So they're not leftists, they're not socialists, but they believe in a certain amount of government involvement. Trump falls very much in this camp. Trump, for example, was kind of a big spender in certain ways. He believed the government should be able to promote the common good. And this common good populist camp also believes that in the social area, the government can, and in some cases must, be involved in upholding civic and social values, conservative values. So now I see the right as defined by the traditional kind of Reaganite camp, but also the new populist camp. And it's a little bit of a jostle to see which one is going to be dominant in the years ahead. Now, the third camp is, of course, the libertarian camp. And this is the camp that is free market in economics, but it's also, you could say, free market in morals, free market in culture. And this camp, I think, is weakening. And by weakening, I mean it's a little ridiculous today to say things like, well, we don't have a problem with Facebook practicing censorship because, after all, it's a private corporation, and we libertarians support the autonomy of the private sphere. When you realize that these corporations have become behemoths. In some cases, they're as big as governments. In some cases, they have more power than traditional governments. And then they're coordinating with the US government. All of that becomes a kind of political gobbledygook. Moreover, I think that with the cultural disintegration we've seen in our society, the idea that we should simply kind of leave it alone, pretend like there's no problem, who cares if the illegitimacy rate is closer to 10% or closer to 90%, this kind of moral indifference that you see in certain parts of the libertarian movement, I think there's no constituency for this anymore. And young people who, by and large, have had a libertarian streak. The young people, I mean, in a sense, coming out of the domain where they're living under the watchful eyes of their parents, tend to be sort of natural libertarians. And yet I find young people today are less libertarian than certainly a generation ago. And then, of course, we have the leftist camp. And the leftist camp is economically socialist, redistributionist, in fact, to a much greater degree than the Democrats and the liberals used to be 40 years ago. And socially, they've become not just libertarian or permissive, but downright radical. And by downright radical, you see this, for example, my daughter Danielle, who's coming on later in the podcast, mentions this in the context of the abortion debate. The left has gone from being pro-choice to being pro-abortion. Pro-abortion is a radicalization of the pro-choice position. It's not just a matter of letting you decide. Yeah, they want you to decide when it comes to certain things, but the explicit advocacy of abortion is a sign, and this, it seems to be, is the most dangerous camp. And I would actually like to see a coalition of the other three camps, obviously working together on issues where they can find common ground to crush this destructive leftist faction that, if it had its will, would destroy the country.